Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation about moths. Of all things, I have to be very thankful to you all for joining us to talk about moths. Um, with so many other things to be thinking and worrying about right now, I appreciate you joining us today to talk about these unsung heroes, unsung jewels of the nighttime, this group of insects that I hope will prove to be endlessly fascinating to you. If you have any trouble with today's presentation, we would prevail upon you to use the chat feature. And Julia is here as our administrator to help you out, making sure that you can see and hear all that we have to share this afternoon. My name is James, and I'm an educator here at the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center. We're a part of Pinellas County Parks, and our mission in parks is to help educate the public about the wonders of nature, and so everyone can enjoy them all the more when they visit our wonderful parks and preserves. If you do have any questions that don't get answered today, or any concerns later on, I am a public servant and I can be reached first initial last name J Stevenson at pinellas.gov. So welcome. Today we're going to spend hopefully a nice dry and cool hour talking about moths. We'll start with what they are. When I teach my classes on nature, I try and give a 35,000-foot view of the topic, a very broad look at the topic, and then we kind of zero in a little bit tighter, learn what makes moths moths, and then we'll take a look finally at some local moths that you might be able to observe within your sphere of influence. So what do you already know? What do you already know about moth? If you've even ever bothered to consider a moth, what do you know? In person, people raising their hands would say things like they fly around at night. They're active at night. They're nocturnal. Moths tend to be kind of drab colors because they're nocturnal and they like to hide against things like tree trunks during the day. They're brown or gray. Some people are aware that they used to be a pest to our clothes back when our clothes were made of natural fibers like silk and wool. And it's true, there are some caterpillars that eventually turn into moths that do like things to eat, like spider webs or other moths' silk or even wool. And some might know that moths are covered in what seems to be some sort of powder or dust. That's generally what normal people know about moths. But from here, y'all are going to be experts. And we'll start from a very, very high point of view and start with the basics. Moths are a type of insect. Insects make up an awful lot of life on Earth. There are a lot of different kinds of insects, and there are a lot of individual insects within each kind. And what makes an insect an insect? All insects share some things in common. Probably the best thing that we know in Jeopardy would be, the three body segments. If it's segmented into three parts, it's an insect. If it's segmented into two things, it could be a spider. Things like six legs. Do you remember the body part names? I bet you do. Head, thorax, and abdomen. There's a little visual cue on the screen right now. So three body parts, six legs. Insect gets its name. The word insect comes from the same root as incision or section, because insects are divided into clear sections. And, biologically speaking, those sections have these three names: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The head being where sensory information is collected through their eyes or through their antennas. It's also where feeding takes place using various mouth parts. The thorax is basically focused on locomotion. And yes, insects do have 6 legs. Insects also have 4 wings, 2 wings in the front and 2 wings in the back. And both pair of wings are attached, like the legs, to the thorax. The third segment, the abdomen, which is concentrated with reproduction, digestion, and respiration. See how much you already knew about insects? 3 parts, each section with its own responsibility, working together to make us a moth or any other type of insect. Within the larger scheme of things, you may have heard of a group of animals on Earth called the arthropods. Maybe you haven't. You have today. The arthropods are those animals that share a common ancient ancestor. 100 million years ago, there was a body type that worked really well underwater at scooting along the bottom of the ocean and being protected from predation with an exoskeleton. Having an exoskeleton meant that any sort of locomotion had to be carried out by limbs that were jointed. And that's what gives this group of animals its name, the arthropods, the jointed legged animals. And that ancient body type was so successful that it branched into all kinds of permutations of that original body design. And you can see that that branch 100 million years ago down here at the bottom of the screen ended up one group ended up becoming the insects and the millipedes and the centipedes and the millipedes. Another group went on to become the trilobites, which didn't work out after a long run. The trilobites, with that basic body type that had developed into the trilobite, um, went on to become what we know today as the crustaceans, including little pill bugs. And a third group went on to become these arthropods with jointed legs, like the scorpions, the ticks, the spiders, and the horseshoe crab. So you see where all these things are related, and you see how they're all different. And the insects are well positioned amongst all these other arthropods. Now, what about moths? Well, within insects, there has been quite a lot of specialization as well. The very first insect, which was based on that original arthropod idea with the 3 sections and the 6 legs and the 4 wings, eventually speciated and diversified into larger groups that we know today. The very first insect resembled modern day mayflies. Another of the very first insects remained unchanged to today's dragonflies. Other groups modified a little bit more, and we have groups like the grasshoppers and the roaches and the earwigs. Another group developed after the origin of this really strange part of the life cycle where an egg does not develop when hatching into an adult, but instead an egg hatches into a very different looking organism than the adult. It goes through a larval stage and undergoes metamorphosis or a complete change in form. And insect groups that go through that change include beetles, which develop from grubs, bees, wasps, and ants, which also have a kind of a grub or a larval phase. You might know the larval form of a fly is a maggot, and the butterflies and moths, their larval form is the very familiar caterpillar. Well done. I can hear you all talking to yourselves at home. And we all know the story of metamorphosis. It's told over and over and over again, not only because it gives young people an idea of just how amazing nature is, but it's such a dramatic change. And the end result, of course, is butterfly, or for us today, moth. This complete metamorphosis from something that looks nothing like the adult into the wonderful adult insect that we have today. And finally, among this one small group of insects called the scaly-winged insects, we have the moths that undergo complete metamorphosis, end up with three body parts, head, thorax, and abdomen, four wings. And the moths diversified after being originated, this perfectly successful body form and life cycle, um, into a incredible diversity of moths that we see today. At some point, there were some moths that stopped mothing the way that all the other moths mothed. And that group became successful at not being quite like all the other moths. And that group branched off and diversified and became, excuse me, became the group of insects that we call collectively the butterflies. So basically, butterflies are a group of moths that are embedded within all the other moths that just didn't do things quite the same. They were successful. They were successful enough to speciate into the myriad of butterflies that we have today. But we're going to talk about what came before the butterflies and the diversity that developed after the butterflies were around, alongside the butterflies. We'll leave the butterflies for another talk for another day and give some credit to the wonderful world of moths for today. There are some micro moths. Yes, that's a word. There are some micro moths that exist today that are very, very similar to the very first moths that did moth properly. They have scaly wings, they have three body parts, they undergo complete metamorphosis, and they have all the other characteristics of moths as we know moths. But these micro moths represent an unchanged version of the very, very first. These moths have chewing mouth parts. Their mouth parts are jaws. Now, they don't work up and down like our jaws do. They work from side to side, but they still perform the same function. They chew. And these micro moths that chew love flower pollen. Flower pollen is very nutrient dense. It's not meant to be eaten. But these moths recognized a good thing when they saw it and associated themselves with flowers, and they ate the pollen, just like the micro moths do today. By being fuzzy little guys, a moth characteristic, they inevitably got covered in that same pollen that they were trying to harvest. And inadvertently, by visiting the same flower as the one they just visited, only on a different plant, they became pollinators because the pollen that they carried accidentally on their bodies allowed them to transfer that pollen from one flower of the same species to another. Those are the primitive moths, the ones that are still mothing just like the original moths. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the extremely highly specialized sphinx moths. They kind of represent the epitome of moth evolution to date. They have extremely long probosces, which is the plural of proboscis, which you've probably heard of. Not a butterfly invention at all. And here you can see a sphinx moth, one of these, you know, jet fighters of the moth world, with its extremely long proboscis, eventually reaching the far end of the spur that grows off the back of the ghost orchid. This proboscis that can reach all the way down to get to the nectar. For the plant, it's able to force the insect to get such a close-up that it can plant its pollen bag right on the forehead of that insect. You might even see the little yellow spot just there on this guy's upper lip. That would be a pollinia that was delivered by another flower that is going to be transferred as soon as the sphinx moth fits his face into the next flower. So from the very unspecialized micro moths to the highly specialized sphinx moths, there's a lot of in between in diversity, but they still have a lot of things in common. Moths tend to be nocturnal, tend to fly around at night. That's something that even normal people know, that moths are associated with nighttime. Why nighttime? What's the benefit of being specialized insects that are active at night? What are some reasons that might lead to that adaptation? Probably number one is predation, predation during the day. And that group of moths that decided to abandon a nocturnal existence and become colorful day flyers, they had to face those consequences of being prey species. But nature abhorring a good meal, nature never turns down a good meal. And so here come the bats. And the bats developed from an ancestor also active at night, as many mammals originally were and still are. Again, to be safe from originally dinosaurs and now everything else. The bats learned of these night flying insects that could be located and hunted down, had very nutrient dense bodies, and, you know, coated in powder, like powdered sugar donuts. So the moths had to adapt. And there's several moths that have defenses against the echolocation of bats. Probably the best studied of these defenses comes from the Luna moth. The Luna moth is a very, very large green moth that has these distinctive trailing ribbons that run off the back of their hind wings. Those ribbons are extremely highly reflective to bats' echolocation, and to the point where the bat can't see anything or detect anything, I should say, but those trailing ribbons. And so, guess what the bat grabs for? Allowing the Luna moth to escape. So, it's always a struggle to keep ahead of their predators. But the original nighttime flying moths, external of all the pressures that they were facing from the bats as the bats developed, what were they doing? What can you do at night if you're a moth? Well, plants that had become associated with moths realized that if we had white flowers, we could help the moths to find us using their eyesight. Poor as it was, white flowers reflect moonlight pretty well. They could be the brightest thing in in the outdoors at nighttime. So white flowers may be pollinated by moths, so they might be eating at night in the cover of darkness. Some moths are just throwing themselves up against light sources. Nobody knows why. Nobody knows why. Um, there's been talk that moths use the moon for orientation. Using a bright light for orientation um, seems that they would prefer to use the sun, which is a lot brighter. So we're not quite sure about that one. Don't really know why they're attracted to lights, but we do take advantage of that. We can talk about that in a little bit. But in the dark, moths have to have supplemental navigation aids, and they do this with often exaggerated antenna. And this little looks like a fenric fox on the left with his feathery antenna held aloft. Those antennae are picking up all kind of environmental signals. The moth on the right, the what looks to me like a salvinia moth, uh, has some pretty exaggerated antenna, and he's holding them across his back, extremely long, again, to help collect extra environmental information that might not be available by the eyes. In close up, you can see a detail of the feathery antenna that are very often sported by moths. You can also get an idea of what that dusty covering is made of. It's made of overlapping scales. And if you remember a few slides back, we had the name of the group of insects that includes the butterflies and moths, the Lepidoptera. That means the scaly wings. And both moths and butterflies are both covered in overlapping scales. It's what helps define them as a mutually exclusive group of insects. And here you can see some of those scales even extending along the main rachis of the antenna. But they're branched and feathered with hairs sticking out, sensory hairs, greater surface area to pick up all sorts of environmental cues. What's the humidity? What's the wind direction? Is it light or dark? Is it hot or cold? All this information can help paint a picture of the nighttime landscape and help our moths to navigate and find a mate. Moths use an awful lot of chemical messaging that are also picked up by the antenna over great distances and at very low concentrations. So a female moth just has to give a little puff of perfume, just a little puff into the night air, and the male with his exaggerated feather-like antenna are going to pick up on that chemical signal. And I don't think I need to explain what that signal is for. It's pretty obvious. It's how moths locate each other for the um, pursuance of more moths. So obviously, if they're reproducing, they are the adult. The moths that we see, the moths that we describe with their feathery antenna and their three body parts and their four wings, that's the adult. What do you recall is the young called? What is the larva called? What is the larva of all lepidopterans called? The larva is the caterpillar. And just like butterflies, because butterflies are just a type of moth, moths come from caterpillars. Some caterpillars are better known than others. Some moth caterpillars can be quite pesty. This is one of the hornworms, a type of caterpillar that loves tomato plants. And so a lot of gardeners spend a lot of effort in trying to get rid of this moth larva, this particular caterpillar, one of the hornworms. So if you are a gardener, you might know the answer to this question. What do caterpillars do? What are caterpillars known for doing? What was that children's book called? The Very Blank Caterpillar? They eat and they eat and they eat and they eat and they eat. They've got nothing else to do. They can't fly. They're larvae. They don't have wings. They can't mate. They're not adults. Make the most of it. Eat. Eating, eating, eating. This looks like, a monarch maybe or a queen. All caterpillars are lepidopteran larvae and they eat. They eat and eat and eat and they keep eating and they eat. And these little caterpillars inch along, measuring the marigolds. The inchworms measure the marigolds. They also measure the earth, giving the moths that develop from the inchworms a special name that we'll look at in just a minute. Of course, the hornworms, voracious. And look at the size of these caterpillars. Very juicy, very nutrient dense. They pack a lot of musculature into their bodies. They have a lot of work to do. Metamorphosis is not easy. It takes an awful lot of energy. This little caterpillar in Hawaii has kind of bucked authority. And instead of eating leaves, this caterpillar hangs out with his little sharp toenails poised in the air. You're not going to believe this. This little caterpillar of a moth in Hawaii will grab flying insects out of the air and devour them. Here he is, the caterpillar, with a termite in his jaws. And before you get the idea to introduce the species into Florida to control termites, let's just press pause on that one. This is a photograph of one of the caterpillars catching by chance a termite. I'm not suggesting at all that they are termite control. They'll grab anything that flies in the sky that is suitable for their diet. Isn't that crazy? Carnivorous caterpillar. What else do caterpillars do? They become food. Caterpillars are probably the most important food source for nesting songbirds. Nesting songbirds very often have altricial young. That means they're helpless. They're just little open mouths that are stuck to they're not stuck to the nest, but they're stuck in the nest. You know, the ones that have no feathers, their eyes aren't open, they're just big gaping mouths. They can't get out and run around and feed themselves. They have to be fed. Those are a lot of the songbirds. Caterpillars make the perfect baby food. Think about it. They're soft and they're nutrient dense. You can shove them down those little babies' throats without doing any damage because they're just soft, juicy caterpillars. So caterpillars are incredibly important to our songbirds. And not having any caterpillars has a very dangerous knock-on effect to our songbird populations. But just like the bats took over the nighttime skies hunting moths, the birds took over hunting the undergrowth for the caterpillars. And the moths had to come up with something to try and mitigate losses. And many caterpillars developed defense systems, including toxins and poisons. Toxins being injectable venom and poisons being consumable toxins. The tussock moth caterpillar, if I had a nickel for every question we get asked about what the hell is that every spring when the tussock moth caterpillars are running around being very numerous, the tussock moth caterpillar is one of those caterpillars with defensive hairs. They have itchy hairs. They have barbs on the tips and sides of these very long whiskers that they cover their body with. And they use those hairs to make their cocoon, to protect their cocoon even. And the tussock moth develops into a very nondescript, mothy looking moth once it emerges from that protected cocoon. Another caterpillar that protects itself is the saddleback. This moth is actually named for the caterpillar from which it develops. It has a very distinct spot in the center of its back, its saddle, and those very, very sharp spines are tipped with hypodermic needles that are trigger loaded to inject venom if they are brushed against. An encounter with one of these caterpillars is unforgettable. And the saddleback turns into a little fuzzy, harmless, probably very digestible and delicious moth, trying to be very camouflaged as an adult because it's lost the ability to defend itself. The Io moth caterpillar is another one of our bristly caterpillars. If in doubt, err on the side of caution because some caterpillars will cover themselves in hairs and spines and they're completely harmless. It's just bluff. But others can cause quite a lot of damage. If in question, if in doubt, guess what? Just don't play with them. The adult Io moth does not have the same defensive capabilities, so it uses bluff as an adult. It has these very distinctive and intentionally frightening eye spots on its hind wings, its two hind wings that are supposed to look like eyes. They're not real eyes. It can't see through these. They're just supposed to look like a much larger predator than the moth itself actually is to scare off anything that wants to bother it. Another stingy caterpillar would be the pus caterpillar or caterpillar, I think named because it has these soft hairs. I used to play with these as a kid. I never got stung. Apparently, I'm just very lucky. Don't mess with fuzzy caterpillars. Observe, leave them to become the moths that they are destined to be. If you leave a puss caterpillar, you might just get one of these little teddy moths. We call them teddy moths, like teddy bears. Southern flannel moth, very fuzzy. Those scales that moths and butterflies cover themselves in this case, exaggerated into more like hairs. So a very, very fluffy southern flannel moth, not uncommon, not very big, definitely worth looking at a close up, and absolutely harmless despite its dangerous phase as an unruly teenager. The hornworms, of course, we mentioned before, the larva of the sphinx moths, very good example of the segmented bodies that insects have throughout their life. Each one of these dark circles along each one of these sections represents a spot along this animal's body with a tube that is opened to the outside air, and that's how they breathe. Not in and out through their mouth. There are no lungs. There's just a series network of smaller, ever smaller tubes that branch throughout their body. They breathe by kind of acting like a bellows and making negative pressure inside their body to draw in air from the outside and squeezing to force the used air, the carbon dioxide, out through those same openings called spiracles. Getting rid of caterpillars, which is not my thing, can take advantage of the fact that they breathe through holes on the side of their body. Using a spray of horticultural oil or soap can clog those holes, and basically the caterpillar suffocates. So when you're advised to use a non-toxic spray like soap or oil, that is its method of activity. But if you leave the hornworms, if you just grow a few tomatoes and let the hornworms have them, you'll be rewarded with some of the coolest, um, arguably coolest moths, the sphinx moths that are shaped like fighter jets and are extremely fast, powerful flyers. Another defense besides venom that caterpillars can employ is pretending to be something dangerous. And you can see the true head chewing or trying to chew the side of a leaf here. And the eyeballs of this caterpillar are located on that head. So, what are the big blue eyes on his shoulders? Those are fake. Those are a bluff. Those are meant to suggest that this animal is actually some sort of very, very dangerous snake and to please avoid. This juicy caterpillar showing that even caterpillars are still insects. That doesn't change just because they don't look like the adult and they don't have three very clear body parts when they're in their larval form. They still have three pair of true legs. What are all the other ones? They are fancy kind of oven mitt, muscly oven mitts. They're not real legs. They're just kind of pot holders that they use. They use hydrostatic pressure to open and close these little oven mitts that they have modified on their hindquarters that act like legs, but they're not actually the true legs. So the difference between butterflies and moths, I think we've talked about a few that butterflies fly during the day and they're very colorful, except for sometimes when they don't, because here's the moth butterfly. We don't get many of these this far south in the peninsula of Florida, but they might be found in the Panhandle area. The moth butterfly, active at night, cryptically colored, kind of a chunky body, kind of stocky antenna. So This is a butterfly that would rather cosplay his ancestors. And then there's some moths that fly during the day, and they're very brightly colored, um, which flies in the face of what we understand moths to be, but they're true moths. These are the oleander moths and the wasp moths. These want you to think they're something else, and they truly are something else. Feeding on oleander means that their bodies are full of poison, just like the monarch butterfly caterpillars are, and the adults tambien. Moths have, compared to butterflies, a very thick body, very squat, wide. Um, all that caterpillar food had to go somewhere, and it went into the development of a very, very thick body. We already mentioned earlier the feathery antenna that a lot of moths have. Um, a characteristic of being mothy is having very feathery antenna. And the true moths make silk and use the silk for a variety of reasons. This little guy, which we saw by the billion dangling from oak trees earlier this year, is a web spinning caterpillar, and it uses its silk to repel off of tree branches and descend into the leaf litter where they can make a silk cocoon and curl up and be snug until it's time to become an adult. Moths make cocoons out of silk. Many moths make cocoons out of this silk, and this happens to be one of our large silkworm caterpillar cocoons that emerge into one of the Saturnid moths. It's basically very expensive spit, caterpillar spit that dries in the air, forming these tensile ten, their tensile strength is very strong. A strand of silk is an incredibly strong, waterproof, decay-proof material. Humans have exploited because we can't turn our spit into beautiful, shiny, expensive fabrics. We take caterpillar spit to do that and make wonderful, expensive silk. Inside those silken cocoons, we have the little pupa or puppet, is what pupa um, translates. And you can see the former caterpillar has now become or is becoming the adult. You can see the outline of what will be the very feathery antenna. You can see what will be the more substantial legs, and you can see the abdomen is going to be short and thick, and the wings eventually be very large. You can even see the little spiracles still present in the pupal stage, but normally we don't see this because it's encased in its silken cocoon. So with that, getting moth general biology out of the way, let's look at some local species that you might see around your house. It is Moth Week. Congratulations for joining the right webinar at the right day, National Moth Week. And if you visit nationalmothweek.org, we're not affiliated. We don't make any money from them. I don't even know if they're selling anything. You might be able to download. They previously offered some very good resource materials that are free to download and use for your education. Nice rough outlines that help you identify moths to their larger family groups. But here, we'll just run through a series of pictures, many of which were taken here at your preserve in the north of Pinellas County on Keystone Road, Brooker Creek Preserve, almost 9,000 acres of unspoiled wilderness right in our overdeveloped county. The little moths that look like the letter T, these haven't been damaged. This is all you get. This is factory settings for the plume moths. The wings are fully functional. These animals can fly. They have 4 wings. They just tuck them across their back into a very narrow, they have a very low profile when they're at rest. The plume moths are characteristic by this T shape that they have. Even out of focus, you can tell a plume moth from any other moths. This is one of the melon worm moths, which is quite showy. Uh, Large eyes to help navigate in the nighttime. The kind of purplish blue tint that you see to this photograph is owing to the fact that we were using a black light to attract the moths to a sheet which was hung up in the woods, and we often attract many, many species of moths at nighttime to ultraviolet lights shining on a white sheet. What's cool about the melonworm, couple of things that are cool about the melonworm is that it has these very high contrast coloration, a black outline and a bright white center, and this funny tuft of hairs off the back end. That is its chemo communication system. That's the epicenter of its chemical communication. It's using that mop-like structure to produce those chemicals that are um, oh so attractive to the opposite in the wild. A large moth, about 2 inches across, is one of the geometrid, geometer, earth measure. So, being a geometer moth, that means that the caterpillar was an inchworm measuring the earth. Geo, earth, metric, measure. And the tulip tree beauty, distinctive for its kind of expressive crossed eyes and the scalloped edges of its wings, otherwise looking very much like tree bark and would be very easily overlooked if it were resting on a tree. As I said, the earth measure or the inch worms become what are known as the geometrid wasp moths. The emerald is a geometrid moth, and so named because they're this lovely pale green color. So they would probably rest with their wings flattened out against a green background to be low profile during the day. But when they fly up to a white sheet when we're catching moths, they're very, very obvious, obviously. The maple spanworm wants you to think that it's a dead leaf, and it's doing a pretty convincing job, right down to that mid vein of this, its fore and hind wings. It's one of the geometrid moths. I keep wanting to say moth, wasp. The grapevine looper is a geometrid. Um, Guess what it eats? Grapevines. Lichen moth larvae feed on lichen. Lichen, of course, is a very strange organism that grows on primarily on tree bark here in Central Florida. Not particularly well studied ecologically, what kind of ecological benefits lichen provides. It's not eaten by many things. It doesn't grow very fast. It's not particularly nutrient dense, but here's a moth whose larva, whose caterpillar, has been known to eat lichen, and it therefore lends its name to the moth that develops from that caterpillar. This is a small, not a micro moth, but a small moth, probably only half an inch long, but very brightly colored and distinctive with those black and red markings. It's a tiger moth, just like the pale tiger moth. Again, highly decorated, more obvious when it is against a blank surface, like a white sheet that we use to trap briefly to borrow moths for photography, and then we release them back again. You can see the patterning on the back of this tiger moth. And another one of the Arabids is the underwing, and this is a large moth that you might see maybe relocating during the day. They like to rest with their wings folded, and the outer wings, their forewings, the wings that are technically in the front, they will fold over their hind wings or their underwings. And when they rest, they look just like tree bark. So they're absolutely invisible. If they're disturbed, they open their front wings, their forewings, to reveal their brightly colored underwings. And that shock of color, that visual shock, is meant to unseat a potential predator and give them the chance to maybe underwing away. I've always said that the rosy maple moth would be a wonderful stuffed animal. Look at how fluffy it is. Look how fuzzy it is. Those scales modified into long hairs, and the color, this lovely pink lemonade and yellow lemonade mix. Um, you know how your phone's always listening to you? I was saying this about rosy maple moths for a few years. Guess what I got an advertisement for? Yes, you can get rosy maple moth stuffed animals. They're like $40. It didn't work. It kind of worked. Okay, it worked. They're one of the Saturnid, one of the large silk moths, like our regal moth, bright red orange with kind of buff colored spots, a very large, like the size of your hand, large. Their caterpillars tend to feed on trees. So nothing endangered about the regal silk moth or the spiny oak worm moth, another one of those pink and orange kind of gaudy, with the two what look like pin marks in each of its forewings. We've discussed the Luna moth earlier and its clever strategy to evade or to bait and switch echolocating bats. This is one of our visiting Luna moths that came. A lot of these obviously clinging to the front screen door here at Brooker. One of our porch lights stays on overnight, every night, and the moths, being attracted to the bright light, hold on to the screen. So summer mornings, we love to run out first thing and see what moths might have been attractive overnight. And sometimes we're rewarded by one of the silk moths, like the grand green Luna moth. We met Io moth before with its fake eye spots. Again, at rest, this moth is going to cover up those eye spots and only reveals them when it's really, really threatened, when it really wants you to get lost. One of the silkworm moths that we had never met before, didn't even know it existed until it appeared on our boardwalk one morning. We used an online human curated identification system called iNaturalist to identify this as a sweet bay silkworm moth. And of course, we have plenty of sweet bay up here in the swamp, but there's very little left in the county in other than in preserves. Sweet bay loves a swamp. Sweet bay loves to have, it's a magnolia that lives standing in the water. And most water in low-lying areas has been drained, and then we put houses on that, and then those houses get flooded. If there weren't houses there, they'd be covered in sweet bay, and we would be covered in sweet bay silkworm moths. Okay, maybe not covered. The false burnet moth makes a strange, fascinating golden filigree cocoon. Never seen anything like it. It's metallic looking. It's reflective gold. And here you can see the pupil skin is still inside the cocoon. And this false burnet moth, looking rather goth, standing on the outside of its golden cage cocoon. We were able to salvage one of these cocoons and we keep it in a very special place for show and tell. Absolutely amazing. The Green Marvel sounds more like a superhero. It's a small tiger moth with what looks like lichen patterning on its back. So if it was at rest on a tree trunk, it could be very easily mistaken for a bit of lichen. So during the day, very well protected. But the Green Marvel has a look-alike that requires higher, greater minds than mine to tell the difference. They're both this kind of lime green, yellowish green color with patterns on the back. But there's the Green Marvel and there's another one called the Hebrew. And I can only assume that it's called the Hebrew because someone thought that the markings on the wings of this moth looked something like Hebrew alphabet characters. A very hungry day-flying moth is the coffee-loving pyrosta. And if anyone is familiar with the little matchstick plant, or it's sometimes called fog fruit or frog fruit or turkey tangle frog fruit, um, those flowers are very, 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 very small. And so this is a very small moth as well. But it gives me the opportunity to show you that this little moth is using a proboscis to probe this tiny, tiny, tiny little tubular flower for nectar. Most moths don't eat. Most moths don't feed. Most moths feed only during their larval phase when they're caterpillars, and only a few will visit flowers for nectar. Many moths don't even have very well-developed mouths. Their mouths, when they come out of the pupal stage and into the adult stage, they don't even have a functioning mouth. Um, Moths are primarily the reproductive phase. A few have maintained the ability to feed, and the little coffee-loving pyrosta is one of them. This caterpillar moth, looking very much like a burnt-out cigar or a broken branch, is one of those non-feeding adult moths. I have nothing to add to this, only what we think it is and what family we think it is, but isn't that a stunning, arguably stunning, maybe a little beat up, bright moth? But the Sphinx moths, lots to say. Fast flying. I said there's a lot to say. Very fast flying, very streamlined. Their larvae are the hornworms, which are voracious eaters. And they're in this funny sphinx family called the Sphingidae. There's a day flying member of the Sphinx group called the hummingbird moth. It flies during the day, hovers in front of flowers, beats its wings so fast that you can't see them. So for all intents and purposes, it's the same size and has the same activity as a hummingbird, but it's an actual Sphinx moth. This hydrangea Sphinx, very lovely collection of greens and grays. The Virginia creeper sphinx, its caterpillar loves the grape relative called Virginia creeper, a native vine that grows in our woodlands and sometimes up the sides of houses. If you want to observe any of these creatures in your own time, someplace where you have permission to be at night, we have a few tips for you. I mentioned earlier the UV light. Moths and many other insects are attracted to UV lights. And so on this simple tripod, we took zip ties and got some very inexpensive strip lights of UV or black lights. They're sometimes called black lights or UV lights. They're just long tubes, encased in some pretty strong plastic, so they're not at risk of being broken. In addition, we have created using one of these light fixtures that you might find in a garage or somewhere like that. We fitted one of the heat lamps that are sold for reptiles to keep reptiles and other um, cold-blooded pets very happy. We chose one that did not emit a red light, but instead white light or full spectrum light. These two together hung in front of a sheet, just an old white bed sheet, brought us a host, hundreds, if not thousands, of insect species, which we were then able to use phone cameras, fancy cameras, and identify these things after dark. It's great fun. It's called Moth Night. It's a event that we have periodically through summer months. Of course, they don't start until after dark, and they go on till about 10 o'clock at night. We We would love to have them go on all night, but we have to call quits somewhere. But this is a setup that you could do at your home anytime you like. Um, it's quick and easy and cheap and can get quite interesting results. If you can get a hold of an incandescent light paired with a UV light, you'd be doing really well. Ironically, the bug lights that are sold that don't attract bugs are actually irresistible to a few groups of true bugs, like the stink bugs. They love those yellow lights. We're not anti-stink bug around here. The UV lights or the black lights in combination with an incandescent or one of those heat lights. If you wouldn't really want to go pro with this, get yourself a mercury vapor light. These require special handling. They require special ballast, but the moths just love mercury vapor lights. Of course, follow all the safety instructions. Be thorough in your preparation before you head out to attract moths. Do all your homework and then be very careful taking your equipment down because these mercury lights can get extremely hot, as can the incandescent. But oh, it's worth it if you can draw in some cool moths. If you want instant identification, wouldn't we all? If you want accurate identification, we recommend using the iNaturalist app. Again, we don't make any money off it. We're not associated with it, but we use it. iNaturalist is supported by the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic, and it is a single source database for observations of the natural world. Artificial intelligence makes the initial identification based on the likelihood of a particular species being in a particular area during a particular time of year. So it already narrows down the possibilities and makes a suggestion. Once you choose to accept the suggestion that artificial intelligence has made, you submit your observation, and then humans look at it. People who specialize in these groups of insects, plants, animals, anything you want to identify can be done through a naturalist. The great thing about it is the results are curated and they help to make the AI better at making its first guess. And it also retains the observation data so that we can track the presence or absence of species in particular areas over time. So there's no reason not to use iNaturalist. It's free and it doesn't steal your identity. What could be better? All right, with 2 minutes to go, my voice is gone, so that's enough moths for today. I'm glad you joined us this afternoon. Thank you very much. If there's something that I didn't cover or if you feel like I got it wrong, please don't hesitate to let me know. Again, that email is jstevenson@pinellas.gov. I'm going to look to see if we have any open Q's and A's or chats. Doesn't look like it. So I am going to thank you again for joining us on this afternoon. Do check us out at Brooker Creek Preserve. Come anytime, Thursday to Sunday. And you can check out this webinar and many more recorded on the Pinellas County Extension YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.